My husband handed me divorce papers on our 44th wedding anniversary. He slid them across the kitchen counter like a business memo and told me he was keeping the house, the retirement accounts, the beach cottage in the Carolinas, and every investment we had built together since we were 27 years old. My attorney called me an hour later and said, "Fight back, fight hard, and fight now." My daughter was sobbing on the phone before noon, but I set the papers down, looked my husband in the eye, and said, "I'll need a few days to think about this." He nodded, satisfied. He kissed my forehead like I was a child he felt sorry for, picked up his golf bag, and walked out the door. He thought I was surrendering. He had no idea I had already started counting. Hello, dear listeners. This is Hannah. I'm so glad you found your way here today. Please stay with me until the end of this story. And when you're done, leave me a comment and tell me what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these words can travel. I was 71 years old when my marriage ended. Not because I wanted it to, and not because I had stopped trying. I was 71, and I had spent the better part of 5 decades being the kind of wife that women in my mother's generation were raised to be. Steady, supportive, invisible in the most useful possible way. I had put my husband through the final years of his cardiology residency, worked double shifts as a labor and delivery nurse for 11 years, while he built his private practice from a single rented office into a respected clinic with 4 physicians on staff. I had raised 2 daughters, managed every household account, hosted every holiday, sat beside my mother-in-law in the memory care facility every Sunday afternoon for the last 3 years of her life, when my husband was too busy to visit. I had been the infrastructure of his entire adult life, and he had long since stopped noticing that the lights stayed on. The first sign came the way it always does. Something small that I almost explained away. We had been to his clinic's annual holiday party in early December. The kind of event held at a rented ballroom downtown with catered food and open bar, and everyone dressed a little better than usual. My husband had been quiet on the drive there, distracted in the way he sometimes was before a presentation or a difficult conversation. But during the party, I noticed he kept gravitating to one corner of the room where a small group had gathered near the bar. A woman in a dark red dress was at the center of that group. Tall, maybe late 30s, with the kind of precise, practiced laugh that women use when they are performing for someone specific. She was the clinic's new patient services director, my husband explained when I finally drifted over and stood beside him. She had only been with the practice 8 months. She touched his arm twice during a 5-minute conversation. He leaned slightly toward her when she spoke. On the drive home, I asked if they had worked closely together recently. He said, "Not especially." He turned up the radio. I let it sit for 3 weeks. I am not a woman who jumps to conclusions. I have spent too many years in a delivery room watching situations that looked catastrophic resolve themselves cleanly, and too many situations that looked fine suddenly turn dangerous. I know how to watch and wait and keep my face calm while my mind is already moving. By January, I was certain. The late evenings that used to be occasional became regular. He stopped asking about my day. The affectionate habit he had of reaching for my hand while we watched television simply stopped. The way a dripping faucet eventually stops, gradually enough that you are not sure exactly when the silence began. He started wearing the cologne he used to reserve for medical conferences. He began complimenting his own appearance in the mirror in a way he had not done in 20 years. I did not cry. I made a plan. I have been managing our household finances since 1981. Every account, every tax return, every investment statement has passed through my hands at some point. My husband was brilliant at medicine and genuinely terrible at administration, which was why he had hired a practice manager when the clinic expanded and why he had always trusted me to handle the household side of things. He considered financial paperwork beneath him. He considered a great many things beneath him by the end, including, apparently, what I began to notice in January, as I sat quietly at the kitchen table going through the previous year's statements, was a pattern of transfers I had not authorized and had not previously examined closely enough. Every few months, a sum between $8,000 and $15,000 moved out of our joint investment account into an account I didn't recognize. I had seen these transfers before but had assumed they were reinvestment transactions, the kind of routine movement that happens inside a managed portfolio. Looking more carefully, I realized the destination account number was not one I had ever seen in our financial records. I wrote down the account number. I wrote down every date and every amount, going back 2 years. I put the paper in the pocket of my winter coat, and I went to bed, and I said nothing. The anniversary dinner was his idea. 44 years, he said, and he suggested the Italian place downtown where we had celebrated our 10th anniversary and our 25th. I thought perhaps I had misread things. I spent 2 hours getting ready. I wore the blue dress he had once called his favorite. He was quiet through most of dinner. Distracted. He drank more than usual. Over dessert, which we had not ordered but which arrived anyway because the waiter assumed we were celebrating something. My husband cleared his throat and said he had been doing a lot of thinking. He said he deserved to be happy. He said we had grown in different directions. He said the word honestly 6 times in 4 minutes, which is always the sign that a person is preparing to say something fundamentally dishonest. Then he slid a manila envelope across the table. I had it drawn up last week, he said. He did not look at me when he said it. He was staring at his untouched tiramisu. My lawyer says it's fair. The house goes to me since it's in my name. The retirement accounts are split on paper, but the structure means I effectively retain control. The beach cottage is under the practice's holding company, so it doesn't factor into the personal asset division. You'll get a monthly support amount that covers basic living expenses. He paused. I've tried to be generous, he said. Generous. I looked at the envelope. I thought about the 11 years of double nursing shifts. I thought about every Sunday afternoon in the memory care facility. I thought about the account number in the pocket of my winter coat. I'll need a few days, I said. He nodded. Of course. Take your time. And then he paid the check, drove us home, and went to sleep in our bed with the ease of a man who has concluded a transaction. I sat in the kitchen until 2 a.m. with the envelope still sealed in front of me and let myself feel the full weight of what was happening. I gave myself exactly 1 hour to cry. Then I made coffee, opened the envelope. The paperwork was thorough. His attorney was good. The language was dense and deliberate, designed to look equitable on the surface while systematically routing every significant asset away from me. The beach cottage through the holding company. The bulk of the investment accounts structured as business assets. The house, which we had bought together in 1989 with a down payment I had contributed to equally, listed as solely his property because his name alone was on the deed. I had never questioned that. We were married. We were partners. I had been a fool to assume that partnership was self-enforcing. But I had been watching, and I had that account number. My older daughter answered on the second ring when I called the next morning, even though it was not yet 7 o'clock. She drove 3 hours from Nashville with coffee and groceries and arrived at my door by 10. We sat at the kitchen table and I told her everything, including what I had found in the statements. Mom, she said carefully, do you know what those transfers are? Not yet, I told her. But I know someone who can find out. When she asked who, I told her I needed a forensic accountant, not a divorce attorney. Not yet. Someone who understood financial fraud and hidden assets. She pulled out her phone and started calling people. By the following Monday, I was sitting across from a man who had spent 20 years as a financial crimes investigator for the IRS before going into private practice. His office was in a building downtown that smelled of good wood and old money, and he listened to everything I said without writing anything down, which I found either impressive or alarming. When I finished, he looked at me for a long moment. "Do you have access to the statements going back further than 2 years?" he asked. "I have access to everything," I said. "I've been managing the household accounts since before my husband and I were married." He smiled. "Then we have somewhere to start." What followed was 2 weeks I will never fully describe to anyone who has not lived through something similar. I became a careful, quiet archaeologist of my own financial life. I photographed documents. I scanned statements. I requested records I had legal access to as a joint account holder. I forwarded everything to the forensic accountant through a private encrypted email address my daughter had helped me set up. I did all of this calmly, systematically, while continuing to cook dinner and tend the garden and respond to my husband's occasional texts about the divorce timeline with brief, non-committal replies. He thought I was processing. He thought I was grieving quietly and moving toward acceptance. I was building a case. The forensic accountant called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was watering the roses. He said, "I need you to come to my office. There are several things you need to see." I sat across from him the next morning while he spread printed documents across his desk, with the careful precision of a man who has done this many times and knows exactly when to pause and let the information land. "Over the past 4 years," he said, "your husband has been transferring marital funds into a private investment account registered to a limited liability company called Meridian Coast Holdings." I noticed my hands tighten on the edge of my chair. "The total transferred is approximately $340,000. He paused. "Additionally, Mrs. He used my name. "I found financial records suggesting your husband's practice has been structured specifically to exclude the beach property and certain equipment assets from the marital estate in anticipation of this divorce. This was not accidental bookkeeping. Someone planned this." I sat with that for a moment. Someone planned this. My husband, the man who still called his mother's old phone number by accident sometimes because muscle memory is a stubborn thing, had spent at least 4 years methodically preparing to leave me with nothing. "What are our options?" I asked. The forensic accountant placed his hands flat on the desk. "In a community property state, all marital assets, regardless of how they are titled, belong to both spouses. If we can prove these transfers were deliberate concealment of marital funds, you are entitled to your share of everything, including what's been hidden. There may also be tax implications for the LLC that create a separate legal problem for your husband entirely." I looked out his window at the street below. "He's going to know I've been looking," I said. "Yes?" said the forensic accountant. "Are you ready for that?" I thought about my husband sliding that envelope across a restaurant table on our anniversary. I thought about my older daughter driving 3 hours before 7 in the morning. I thought about 11 years of double nursing shifts, and every Sunday afternoon I had given away quietly, without complaint, without credit. "I have been ready," I said, for longer than I knew. My husband noticed the change within days. I had stopped asking whether he wanted dinner held warm. I stopped leaving the front light on when he came home late. I was polite, even pleasant. But I had removed the 1,000 small accommodations that a person offers out of love and habit, and their absence was its own kind of language. He cornered me in the kitchen one evening. "Have you thought any more about the papers?" he asked. His voice was careful, calibrated. "I'm still working through some questions," I said. His eyes narrowed. "Margaret," he said, and caught himself. He had called me by the wrong name. He recovered quickly, said something about deadlines and legal fees, said his attorney was getting impatient. I nodded pleasantly and said, I understood. That night, I lay in the guest room where I had been sleeping for 3 weeks and stared at the ceiling and felt the fear move through me in slow, cold waves. At 71, The arithmetic of starting over is brutal. I had no income. My nursing license had lapsed years ago. Social Security would cover less than a third of what I needed to live on. If I lost this house, if I accepted the settlement he was offering, I would spend whatever years I had left in genuine financial precarity, dependent on my daughters, embarrassed, diminished. The fear was real, but underneath it was something else, something that had been building since December, since I had stood at that holiday party and watched a woman in a red dress touch my husband's arm and seen him lean toward her like a plant toward sun. Anger, clean and focused, the kind that does not make you stupid, but makes you precise. I called Patricia Hendricks the next morning. She was a family law attorney my younger daughter had found. A quiet woman in her mid-50s who had spent 20 years on high-asset divorces and who listened to everything I told her without surprise or interruption. When I finished, she said, "You've done a considerable amount of preparatory work." I said, "I had some good help and a lot of years of paying attention." She filed on my behalf 3 days later. My husband came home that evening with the particular energy of a man who has received bad news at work and has been managing it all day through gritted teeth. He found me in the garden. He stood at the back door with a look on his face I had not seen in 20 years, since the early days when things between us were still real enough to produce genuine anger. "What have you done?" he said. I looked up from the rose bush I was pruning. "I've filed for divorce," I said. "With my own terms." His voice went very quiet. "I've been more than fair to you. You've attempted to take $340,000 of marital assets and put them where I couldn't find them," I said. "I would not call that fair." The color in his face changed. His jaw worked. "You went through my private accounts." "Our accounts," I corrected. "Community property, sweetheart. I've been your household CFO for 44 years. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the pattern?" He took 2 steps toward me and then stopped himself. His voice, when it came again, was quiet and dangerous. "You're making a serious mistake. I have resources you don't. My attorneys will tie this up in court until you've spent every dollar you have fighting me. You'll be worse off than if you'd just taken the settlement. Or," I said, "the court will find the hidden LLC very interesting." He left without another word. The back door closed hard enough to rattle the kitchen window. I turned back to the rosebush and finished what I was doing. My hands were shaking, but they were still cutting. The next morning, his attorney called. A man with a smooth, measured voice who introduced himself as if I should recognize the name of his firm. "Mrs.," he said, "I think there's been some unnecessary escalation here. My client is prepared to revise the settlement offer significantly. The house, for instance, he's willing to transfer the deed fully to you rather than requiring a year's grace period. The monthly support figure would increase by 40%. All of that in exchange for dropping the financial investigation and signing the revised agreement by the end of the week." I thanked him for calling. I told him I would consider it. I hung up and called Patricia immediately. "They're scared," she said when I told her. "Good. Don't take it." "I know," I said. What I did not say, because I could not fully explain it even to myself, was that by then, it was no longer purely about money. It was about something harder to name. Every woman who had ever been told that keeping a home was not real work. Every woman who had been patted on the hand and called impractical when she asked questions about finances. Every woman who had loved someone for 44 years and been quietly written out of the story she had spent her life contributing to. I was not in that courtroom for myself alone, though I was certainly there for myself. I was there for something bigger than the number in the settlement offer. My younger daughter flew in from Phoenix without telling me she was coming. I opened the door and found her on the porch with a suitcase and a bottle of good wine and the exact expression of her grandmother. which is to say, fierce and slightly terrifying. She said, "I took the week off. You don't get to do this alone." I held her for a long time in the doorway. That night, both my daughters sat with me at the kitchen table, and we spread out every document the forensic accountant had assembled, and they asked careful questions. And I watched them understand fully what their father had been doing. My younger daughter cried. My older daughter did not cry. She looked at the transfers, looked at the LLC structure, looked at the timing, which began approximately 4.5 years ago. And she said, quietly, "He started planning this before I even knew anything was wrong." Neither of them chose their father's side. I want to say that simply because I know how much that sentence means to women in this situation, and I know it is not guaranteed. We reconvened in court 7 weeks after I had filed. Patricia had coordinated with the forensic accountant to prepare a presentation of the financial evidence that was methodical, clear, and difficult to argue with. The transfers, the LLC, the deliberate restructuring of the practice's asset declarations in anticipation of divorce proceedings. The expert testimony about the patterns of hidden asset concealment. My husband sat at the other table with 2 attorneys, and an expression of controlled anxiety that I recognized from 30 years of watching him before difficult cases. He was managing himself, working hard to project authority and calm. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the manner of someone who has heard every variation of this particular story and whose patience for it is not limitless. She looked at the financial documents with focused attention. She asked several sharp questions of his attorneys that they struggled to answer cleanly. She looked at my husband twice over the course of the morning with an expression that reminded me of the nurses I had always respected most, the ones who did not shout, but whose disapproval was total and unmistakable. When Patricia called the forensic accountant to testify, something shifted in the room. The transfers were dated. The LLC was documented. The motive was clear. My husband's lead attorney objected repeatedly and was overruled repeatedly. My husband himself leaned over twice to whisper urgently to his attorney and was twice waved off. Then Patricia asked the court to consider one additional piece of documentation, a series of communications between my husband and the patient services director, his patient services director, recovered through a legal discovery request that made clear the timeline. The relationship had begun 14 months before he handed me those papers on our anniversary. The LLC had been established 16 months before. The asset restructuring had begun 19 months before. He had started hiding our money 2 months before the affair had even fully begun. He had been planning his exit before he had even found someone to exit for. The judge looked at my husband for a long, quiet moment. He looked at the table. She ruled the same afternoon. "A preliminary ruling," she said, pending full forensic audit. But her direction was unambiguous. All joint and marital assets, including those held by Meridian Coast Holdings, were frozen immediately pending review. I retained sole possession of the house. Temporary support was set at $4,500 per month. She looked at my husband's attorney and said that the court would be pursuing further inquiry into the asset concealment and that the IRS had already been notified of potential irregularities in the LLC's filing history. She then looked directly at my husband and said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "In this court's view, the most troubling element of this case is not the financial misconduct, which is serious and will have serious consequences, but the duration and deliberateness of the concealment. 44 years of marriage deserves better than 4 years of calculated betrayal." My husband said nothing. He looked, for the first time since December, like the man he actually was. Outside the courthouse, both my daughters were waiting. My older daughter had her arms crossed and a look of satisfaction that she was working to contain. My younger daughter simply held my hand for a long time without saying anything. Patricia told me that the full hearing in 30 days was likely to produce a final ruling significantly in my favor, and that the LLC irregularities had created potential legal exposure beyond the divorce proceedings. I thanked her and meant it. That evening, I drove myself home and sat in my garden until the light was gone, and I was aware of something I had not expected to feel for a long time. Calm. Not the performed calm of the past 2 months, the careful, strategic steadiness I had maintained, like a mask, but actual quiet. The kind that comes when you have done what needed to be done, and the outcome, whatever it turns out to be, is no longer in your hands. The final hearing came 30 days later. By then, much had already changed. The IRS inquiry had become an audit. The audit had expanded. The LLC had been found to contain not only redirected marital funds, but certain equipment financing arrangements connected to the practice that raised separate questions about billing and expense reporting over a period of several years. My husband's professional liability insurer had initiated its own review. 2 of the physicians on his practice staff had retained separate counsel. He arrived in court without his lead attorney, who had withdrawn from the case. His new representation was a single attorney who looked overworked and whose suit was not as good. Patricia presented the forensic accountant's final findings. Total marital estate value, including all hidden and reclassified assets, approximately $1.1 million. Amount concealed through the LLC and practice asset restructuring, approximately $420,000. Additional marital property interests in the beach cottage, previously excluded through the holding company. Appraised value, $180,000. The judge awarded me 62% of all marital assets. The house, in its entirety, deed transferred to my name. The beach cottage, half its appraised value in liquid assets, spousal support of $5,200 per month for 12 years or until remarriage. All legal fees to be paid by my husband. Additionally, she noted, the court was filing referrals to the relevant professional licensing board and to federal financial regulators regarding the evidence uncovered in discovery. What the licensing board and federal authorities do with those referrals, she said, is outside this court's jurisdiction. But this court will not ignore what it has found. My husband did not look at me when the ruling was read. I looked at him once, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with the particular clarity you feel when something you have been carrying for a very long time is finally set down. I did not hate him. I had loved him for too many years to arrive at hatred easily, and I did not have the energy for it. But I was done. Completely, finally, irrevocably done. Outside, my daughters were waiting again. My younger daughter threw her arms around me before I reached the bottom step. My older daughter, who is more like me, simply looked at me for a moment and then nodded once, which in our family is a full declaration of love. That is not the end of the story. Not really. Because endings in real life are rarely as clean as they are in movies. There is an extended period of paperwork and transfers and conversations with financial advisors. And one very long Saturday morning spent with my older daughter reorganizing every account, every statement, every record into a system that I control completely and understand completely. Because I will never again leave that work to someone else. The patient services director, I heard through mutual acquaintances, had quietly left the practice around the time of the first hearing. She had taken a position with a medical group in another state. My husband, I was told, had reached out to her after she left. I was told she did not respond. I cannot say I was surprised. Women who position themselves as replacements for established, long-term partners often find, when the partner has been displaced, that the role was less appealing than it had appeared. My husband's professional situation continued to deteriorate after the divorce was finalized. The licensing board inquiry took 14 months and resulted in a formal censure and a suspension of his medical license for 1 year. The federal review, which concerned certain billing practices over a 5-year period, resulted in a settlement that cost him nearly everything he had retained after the divorce. I did not follow these developments closely. My daughters kept me informed in the way you inform someone about weather in a city you are no longer traveling to. Relevant for context. Not personally urgent. He called me once, about 8 months after the final ruling. I answered because I recognized the number and was curious, perhaps because after 44 years there is a kind of muscle memory to responding. He said he was sorry. He said it several times. He said he had made the worst decision of his life, and he knew it, and he was living with it. He sounded tired and smaller than I had ever heard him sound. I believed him. I think he genuinely was sorry, in the way that people are sorry when consequences have arrived and cannot be argued with. I said I appreciated him calling. I wished him well, and I meant it. I did not suggest we speak again. Then, I went back to my garden. I sold the house the following spring. I know that might sound strange given how hard I had fought to keep it, but the truth was simpler than it appeared. I had fought for the house because it was mine and I refused to be robbed of it. Not because I needed to live inside those particular walls forever. What I needed was the victory, the confirmation that what I had built was real and had value, and could not simply be taken from me by a man who had stopped seeing it. Once I had that, the house itself became something different. A chapter I had written and closed. I bought a smaller place about 40 minutes outside of the city. A single-story house on a quiet street with a garden that gets afternoon sun and a screened porch where I drink coffee every morning and watch the birds and feel consistently and without effort happy. My younger daughter visits every few months. My older daughter calls 3 times a week. I have a book club on Thursday evenings with 6 women, 2 of whom have become genuinely close friends in the way that friendships in your 70s can be. Without the social performances of earlier life, just 2 people who find each other's company worthwhile and say so directly. I started auditing classes at the community college, not for credit, simply because I had always wanted to study art history, and there was no longer any reason not to. My professor is a wiry, enthusiastic man of about 40 who does not talk down to the older students, and who once told me, after I made a comment about a Vermeer that sparked a 20-minute discussion, that I should have been in this field decades ago. I told him I had been busy building a life. He said it showed. I think sometimes about the woman I was on that anniversary evening, sitting across a restaurant table from a man who was preparing to hand me my own erasure in a manila envelope. She was not weak. She had never been weak. But she had not yet discovered the particular kind of strength you find when you stop accommodating and start protecting. That woman would not recognize the life I am living now, and I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give myself. What would I tell you if you are where I was? I would tell you to know your finances, not in broad strokes, not, I think we have some investments somewhere, but specifically by account number, by institution, by amount. I would tell you that a joint account should mean both names and both pairs of eyes on every statement. I would tell you that if something feels wrong, you are probably right, and that acting on that feeling early costs far less than acting on it late. I would tell you that a forensic accountant is worth every dollar you pay them when the situation calls for one, and that a good attorney who has seen this before is worth more than 3 mediocre ones. But most of all, I would tell you this: the strength you will need is already in you. It is built from every difficult thing you have already survived. Every decision you made quietly and correctly when no one was watching. Every time you kept going when going felt impossible. You have been preparing for this without knowing it. When the moment comes, you will be ready. I was 71 years old and I was starting over, and I was, to my considerable surprise, not afraid. The roses I planted last spring are blooming now, right outside the porch where I'm recording this. It is a good morning. It is, in fact, quite a good life. If this story found you at the right moment, please share it. And if you've been through something similar and you want to talk about it, I'm right here. That's why I come back every week. Thank you for listening. This is Hannah, and I'll see you in the next one.